1548 UK time, Monday the 6th of January 2025. Today I'm going to be looking at the gods of technology. Are there any gods of technology? Is any gods backing technology? So I'm going to explore a mixture of audio and visuals. Right? So let's get in there. Rifleman, this is JTV. Like, share and subscribe. Comment, comment, comment.
And I'm so grateful to be in such a beautiful place, and I want to thank everyone who made my visit possible and this event. I'm really looking forward to the presentations and the discussions in the next couple of days. Well, as Stephen said, my research started with the question, who first imagined robots, replicants, automatons, and even artificial intelligence? Now, historians of technology usually trace the first self-driven machines to the Middle Ages when they had clockwork mechanisms. But I wondered, was it possible, could it have been possible, that the idea, the concepts of making artificial life, automatons, and even AI, could those ideas have appeared much earlier? Could people in antiquity imagine such things long before the technology ever made them possible? And I found that the surprising answer is yes, if you look at myth. It turns out that more than 2,500 years ago, in the time of Homer, a set of vivid Greek myths envisioned how one might fabricate artificial life, robots, and synthetic beings. These animated, self-moving creations were made using what the Greeks might have called biotechne, life through craft in ancient Greek, and today we call it biotechnology. So long before the technological innovations of the Hellenistic era, which began in the 4th century BC, and at that time people were making animated statues and other machines, long before that, there were imaginative ideas about creating artificial life, and they were being explored in, as I said, Greek mythology, in what we might call ancient thought experiments. The mythical artificial replicas of life were described in ancient texts as beings that were made, not born. That is, they were imagined as manufactured, fabricated somehow through craft, not reproduced biologically, and they weren't simple magic either. That phrase, made, not born, I think is really a crucial distinction. It sort of is a dividing line between natural and unnatural, biological and artificial, human and non-human. These beings were not just lifeless objects that were brought alive by a magical spell or a god's command. They weren't brought to life by fiat. These synthetic beings were imagined as actually products of technology. They were made by gods using familiar tools and materials and methods of the day, but because the makers were gods, the results were awesome. And these marvelous automatons appeared, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with many of these myths, in myths about Jason and the Argonauts, battling bronze robots in the form of giant androids and animals, in the myths of the firebringer Prometheus, and the story of Pandora, the artificial woman that was created by Hephaestus, the god of invention and technology. So tonight I just thought we would look at some classical Greek stories about automatons from 2,500 years ago, maybe even earlier, the earliest imaginings of robots and replicants, and basically these are some of the first ever science fiction stories. Okay, let's start with the very first automaton to walk the earth, and I'm talking about mythology, of course. It's Talos. He was a giant bronze robot made by Hephaestus, the god, was a blacksmith, and also the god of invention and technology. And this myth is very ancient. It was first written down in about 700 BC by Hesiod, and many others afterwards elaborated on the story and retold it. Talos was a killer robot that defended King Minos' kingdom of Crete. He was defending the whole island against invaders from the sea. Talos was self-moving. It was said he could march around that large island of Crete 3 times a day. That means he went 500 miles an hour, but this is science fiction, so it's interesting that someone actually went to the trouble of calculating that. And Talos was programmed, you could say, to spot invaders and then pick up rocks, hurl boulders at approaching ships to sink them. And we have some ancient coins from Crete that they boasted about Talos. On these coins from Phaistos in Crete, made in about 350 BC, they show Talos throwing rocks. And here's another one, also made in about 350 BC. And I just want to point out that the other side of this coin that shows Talos shows another guardian made out of metal, gold in this case, that helped to defend Crete, made for King Minos. This is the golden wonder dog, also known as Laelaps, an artificial hound that never lost its prey. And like Talos, that golden hound was made by Hephaestus. And here's an ancient vase painting showing the animated wonder dog made of gold. And I just think it's interesting to look at this modern artist's impression of Laelaps as a robot dog. This is an artist for some sort of video game, and it's remarkable to me how similar his rendition of Laelaps looks to the ancient vase, which is an extremely rare, obscure vase. I doubt that he ever saw it. It's just an interesting coincidence. But to return to Talos, in close combat, should any sailors actually make it ashore, the bronze robot could heat his metallic body red hot, and then he would grab up a victim and hug them to his chest and roast them alive. It's sort of it's a very perverted, awful idea of the embrace. It's a perversion of the idea of a hug. And this ancient Etruscan mirror from about 450 BC illustrates that capability. And what's interesting about Talos is that we even know something of his inner workings. And I think these details sort of confirm that he was imagined as a technological product. Talos, we are told, had a single tube or artery running from his head to toe. And the word that was used for that tube is actually a biological term for vein or artery. And yet this is a bronze machine. Now, instead of blood, ichor pulsed in that artery. So Talos was thought of as a kind of part living, part machine being powered by ichor. What is ichor? It's the mysterious life force of the gods. It's what makes them immortal. And his entire vivisystem was sealed with a bronze bolt on his ankle. Now, in the myth, Jason and the Argonauts encountered Talos on their quest for the Golden Fleece when they tried to drop anchor in Crete. And I hope there are some people who like films here, because I have quite a few references to modern movies and films. After all, they're all cultural dreams. And Talos is familiar to many people today. If you are a fan of this sort of cult movie, Jason and the Argonauts from 1963, it had this unforgettable stop-motion animation figures created by Ray Harryhausen. And in the ancient myth, Jason and the Argonauts were doomed to become the next victims of Talos. Now here we have Talos on a very famous vase, so famous that the painter is called the Talos painter, made in the 5th century BC. And you can see here that Talos is portrayed as a giant man made of bronze. If you look at this pair of images from antiquity, you can see that the artists used the same technique to depict Talos and to show bronze armor. Now, luckily, Jason and his men were saved by the powerful sorceress or witch called Medea. And it was Medea who figured out how to destroy or disable the bronze robot. And she used a combination of persuasion and technology. She was able to convince Talos that she could make him immortal. And here on the vase painting, you can see that she's there trying to convince Talos to take her advice. She convinced him that she could make him immortal, but only if he would allow her and Jason to remove that bronze bolt on his ankle. And Talos agreed to that. And Medea and Jason unsealed the bolt so that his power fluid, the ichor, would flow out. And we know this is an extremely ancient idea because we have vase paintings from the 5th century BC showing Jason using a tool to remove the bolt. So Talos was imagined as made by technology, and he was destroyed by technology. And I think that could be a little lesson for us today. No matter how advanced your technology is, there might be a hacker who can find the weak point.
Why Nothing Can Travel Faster Than Light book and other scientific curiosities. In 1943, the first electronic computer was constructed, called Colossus. It employed 1,500 electronic tubes, was programmed by 2 rolls of punched paper tape, and spent its day busily cracking German codes during World War II. These huge affairs were the first generation of electronic computers. By 1947, the transistor replaced the vacuum tube and ushered in the second generation of computers, smaller, faster, and more powerful. Since then, there have been a third generation computers with integrated circuits and fourth generation computers with what is termed very large scale integrated circuits. So at each new level, the capabilities of the computer increased. Outstanding problems in physics, engineering, and chemistry. And even accurate weather forecasting would be impossible without computers. But can computers think? Are machines truly intelligent? That, of course, depends on how we define intelligence. In the early days of computer design, Alan Turing, a pioneer in the field, set a single requirement for machine intelligence. It was simply that in teletype communication with a machine, he would be unable to tell that it was not a human being. In 1957, a group of computer experts at Dartmouth College decided that the better a machine was able to mimic human behaviour, the smarter it was. The outcome of this gathering was a new scientific discipline called artificial intelligence.
In the myth, the ichor was said to flow out like molten lead, and Talos toppled over and collapsed. This is an image from a new TED Ed animation lesson about Talos. And it shows Medea chanting her incantations while Jason removes the bolt. Ancient Greek plays and artworks about Talos depicted him as a metallic robot, but he had human-like features. He was imagined as kind of, as I said, a cyborg creature, sort of a machine-human hybrid. And Medea's really a sort of techno-wizard. She guessed that Talos might have developed human-like desires and that he would fear death. Of course, he was made as a robot to be a perpetual guard for Crete, but she was able to convince him. He turns out he feared death. He wished to be immortal, invulnerable. Talos could be persuaded and fooled by Medea, and that's another human feature of this robot. Now, today psychologists try to understand why we tend to anthropomorphize robots, why we might feel empathy for them. We do seem to be kind of hardwired to bestow emotions on things that seem alive to us, and especially if they have a name and a backstory, like Talos did. Now, some of you might remember the famous Stanley Kubrick film, 2001, 1968, in the iconic scene, the computer HAL. He seems the most human when he's being deactivated, destroyed by the astronaut. And as he's dying, he tells his name and begins to recite memories, his backstory that he's been given, memories from his supposed childhood. In the 1963 film Jason and the Argonauts, the robot has an expressionless face made of bronze, but the astonishing animation sequence did manage to suggest somehow glimmers of personality and sentience and emotion in Talos. And in that poignant scene, as his life fluid is bleeding out, the great robot is struggling to breathe. He clutches his throat while his bronze body cracks and crumbles. And the modern movie audience feels pity for the helpless giant. Human qualities are what make that robot's destruction feel tragic. Just like in antiquity, when people were at the theater and there were plays about Talos, unfortunately lost now, the people felt sympathy for the robot who was tricked and killed while he was simply doing his job. Now, in this ancient vase painting, made more than 2 millennia ago, the dying Talos is shown as a large man of bronze. He's shown at the moment when he's falling backwards as Jason is removing the bolt. His eyes roll up, and this artist, amazingly, painted a teardrop falling from the robot's eye. The ancient idea of a metal automaton guard cast in android form, human form, like Talos, that captured the imagination of other artists, especially in the Middle Ages. We have a medieval painting from about 1350. Here's Alexander the Great fighting 2 golden robots guarding a bridge. And then in the medieval tales of King Arthur and Knights of the Round Table, Sir Lancelot also was said to fight robots guarding bridges and castles. The mythic figure of Talos inspired the medieval poet Edmund Spenser in his epic poem The Faerie Queen, written in 1596. We see Talos now as the Iron Knight, also named Talos. And the Iron Knight was a relentless killer robot without mercy. A good question posed by Edmund Spenser using that the old theme of Talos. Can a killer robot actually serve justice? Interesting theme for AI today. Some people wonder whether justice could be done or carried out by AI. And it's interesting that Leonardo da Vinci also made an Iron Knight a few years before Edmund Spenser wrote his poem. Now you might ask, what might have inspired the ancient storytellers in Greece who first described and illustrated Talos? One influence might have come from the Mediterranean island of Sardinia. In recent years, archaeologists have excavated about 40 colossal stone statues on the island of Sardinia. They were made in about 900 to 600 BC by the Nuragic culture. And this kingdom in Sardinia did have close ties with Crete. And some ancient Greek writers actually reported that Talos, before he came to protect Crete, had originally defended Sardinia. I see some of you smiling. I think one of those faces has a kind of familiar look to it. Maybe there's an ancient robot face.
Artificial intelligence, AI, the technology that allows a computer to think like a human. And it's everywhere you look. Online shopping, virtual assistants like Siri and Alexa.
Welcome to the Church of England.
But as AI gets smarter and smarter, how will it affect religion?
Well, AI helps people get closer to their spirituality.
Different faiths are starting to use it. Robots can deliver sermons, give advice,
Santo, does God exist?
and pray with you.
It's a bit like Catholic Alexa.
But could it be dangerous?
For some people, that's a concern that we are stepping into God's shoes.
Or even sacrilegious?
The robot will never replace a rabbi because he has no soul.
As every major global faith is discussing its relationship with AI, we want to find out if it will transform religion. This Buddhist temple is more than 400 years old. And inside is a robot. It's designed to look like Kanon, the goddess of mercy. It's called Minder. It's neither man nor woman. It's made of aluminium. Its hands, shoulders and face are covered in silicone to resemble human skin. Monk Tensho Goto thinks this robot can teach people the true essence of Buddhism.
この部分はロボットの方が優れてます。私は死んだらもうそこで、だけどね、ロボットはね、一番いい方法をずっと考えながら、AI で考えながら進化させていくことができるわけです。これは優れたもんですね。ロボットは死ぬことがない。
These university students have come to see Minder for the first time. A whole sermon delivered by a robot.
最初の印象は正直っていうその中になんか心があるのかなってぐらい実在してるのかなって。アンドロイドは若い人たちに仏教っていうことを伝えていける。
But not everyone felt at ease with it.
機械の声っていう感じがして。
私はアンドロイド観音の説法を聞いて実際手を合わすっていう気には少しならなかったんですけど、なぜならなかったかというと、多分私自身にもその囚われがあって。
Should we automate spirituality? Isn't it a bit sacrilegious?
それは冒涜でも何でもないです。それがね、徐々にあるがあれだろうが、やっぱ他の宗教にも変化を与えるだろうなと私は思っております。
Is Monk Goto right? Will other religions be as open to robots and AI? Here in Poland, Catholicism is the predominant faith. Gabriele Trovato has been building this for the past year, and it's almost ready. Its name is Santo. Gabriele says this is the first ever Catholic robot.
It was clear to me last year during the lockdown when many people started complaining they couldn't go to church. So in this sense, a machine like Santo can give a hand.
Are you proud of Santo?
Yes, it's my son. It's my baby.
Santo is programmed with 2,000 years of knowledge about the Catholic faith. He's ready to meet worshippers for the first time.
My name is Santo. What brings you here on this beautiful day?
Santo, is there a heaven?
It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for someone rich to enter the kingdom of God.
So you wouldn't answer my question directly about whether there is a heaven, but I did reply with a verse of the Bible that I thought was quite relevant.
Dzień dobry, Santo. Nasze bliskie, które są w niebie.
What did you make of it?
Byłam sceptycznie tak nastawiona do robota, że nie do końca miałam rację, że czasami nam pomaga swoje myślenie skierować na właściwe tory.
I think it is impressive. It's a bit like Catholic Alexa.
Do you think that it gave you a satisfying answer?
Well, I think that's the problem with artificial intelligence, that sometimes those answers are very vague. You're not asking where the closest restaurant is. You're asking about spiritual things. So he's helping you finding the own answer.
But not everyone is sold on Santo.
Would you?
People here have mixed feelings about the robot. Most of them said they prefer a human priest, but they were surprisingly open-minded. One of them said anything that brings you closer to God is a good thing. Where did you get the inspiration to start building Santo?
Looking at my grandmother's house, she keeps a lot of icons and small statues that are commonly used for praying. And I realized that if these statues could talk back, then they would make her company.
So Santo is meant as a prayer companion, not as a priest replacement. He's not as high-tech as Minder from Japan, but because he's built to look like a statue of a Catholic saint, people find him more familiar.
H is for heaven, hell, and other afterlives. What's going to happen to us when we die? We know what happens to our bodies. But is that it? Millions of people in many different religions believe that we're not just bodies and brains, we're also souls. We're spiritual, and our souls can't die. If that's true, where do they go? The religions don't quite agree about that. Each one has a different version of the afterlife. In Christianity, there's hell, a realm of fire, where the devil punishes souls who have committed unforgivable sins. And heaven, the kingdom of God. But different Christians have different understandings of what heaven and hell really mean. In the Middle Ages, many Christians believed that hell was an actual place under the ground, and that if someone dug a deep enough tunnel, they'd find it. Though, of course, they probably wouldn't want to. Many Christians today say that because God is loving and is prepared to forgive any sin, then hell's just a metaphor for the way people suffer in their hearts. Just to make things even more complicated, there's also a third place. In some branches of Christianity, like Catholicism, there's purgatory, somewhere between heaven and hell. Souls who go there have sinned, but God might eventually forgive them once their sins have been cleansed. So it's a bit like a waiting room, but without the magazines, unless there are special purgatory magazines. In Islam, there is Jannah, or paradise, which is very similar to heaven, and Jahannam, which is very similar to hell. But in Islam, souls don't go there when they die. The dead are simply dead and buried in the ground, their souls waiting for the day of judgment. Only Allah knows when it will be, but it won't be a great day for insurance companies as he'll return to Earth and destroy everything. The dead will be resurrected, and only those whose good deeds outweigh their bad will be able to access Jannah. The view is quite different for Buddhists, because for them, the world is a place of suffering, and when we die, we're reborn and start all over again. In an almost never-ending cycle of lives, you might go from plant to animal, even to a ghost or a god. Being born as a human is a precious opportunity to gain wisdom and escape this cycle of suffering by attaining enlightenment, or nirvana. One thing that all religions agree on is that what happens to a person's true self when they die isn't random and isn't inevitable. It's determined by the choices they've made when they were alive. It's a bit like life is a big test and death is when you get the results.
Paradise that can be programmed, where artificial intelligence offers happiness, beauty, and life eternal.
Our intelligence levels are growing. It's only a matter of time before we evolve beyond humans.
해주께서는 제가 무엇으로 보이십니까?
부처이십니다.
So how scientific are these dataist dreams? The latest physical insights into the human spirit seem to imply that the possibilities are almost limitless.
Life after death, or
Life after death.
reincarnation?
Reincarnation. But you see maybe something true amongst all these crazy ideas.
Like, why do you want to live? What's the point? What inspires you? What do you love about the future?
Movie maker Hans Bustra, a Protestant minister's son who turned his back on the church, goes in search of spirituality in this age of technology. This is Backlight. Welcome to Eternal Life.
With a minister for a father, I had a deeply religious upbringing. In my 20s, I attended an evangelical church and took part in modern religious rituals. One of them was going out into nature with my fellow believers, my brothers, in order to meet God.
Nou, zoals wij hier staan, God heeft jou bedoeld als een heiligdom. Hij heeft je mooi gemaakt. Hij heeft je sterk gemaakt. Hij heeft een plan met je leven.
My life had a plan, a purpose, and I would discover it if I looked for God in nature. That was the idea. The highlight of that all-male weekend was walking through icy cold water for 1 kilometer. I clearly remember the warmth I felt despite that freezing water. We believed in a grand story together, in which life had meaning and was inspirational. That, I think, is at the heart of all forms of religion and spirituality. We look for meaning in the conviction that there is something higher, something transcendent that we humans cannot perceive directly. But it definitely connects us and makes our lives meaningful. Since it's so mysterious and supernatural, it also defies our ratio. For precisely that reason, I ended up leaving my church. I had too many critical, scientific objections to religion. As a documentary filmmaker, I got to meet communities that are 100% rational and scientific and do not require faith. Technological progress as the meaning of life. You don't need God for modern miracles. And everyone is welcome in the community. But despite all the blessings, I discovered that the birth of our digital technology has a lot in common with the myth of Pandora's box. The miracle of the first computer was used for calculations for a bomb. In the scientists responsible, among them physicist Oppenheimer, this technological achievement evoked religious feelings.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Science historian George Dyson wrote, "The real explosion was not the hydrogen bomb, but digital code. For the first time in history, numbers in the form of digital algorithms came to life and spread across the globe with the speed of light." Forum Groningen, a brand new event center in downtown Groningen, has as its opening exhibition something you might call the holy grail of Dadaism, artificial intelligence. I feel like I'm in a 21st century cathedral, as they give me a short private lesson on a modern Genesis story.
De Golem is het oudste voorbeeld van AI wat we hebben. Het is eigenlijk meer een soort verhaal wat van 2000 jaar geleden al ontstaan is. En eerst in het Hebreeuws opgeschreven in de Talmud. Omdat het toen om een soort rituele, religieuze handeling ging. Waarbij je samen een kleipop opbouwt. En met de speciale spreuken die dus staan omschreven, dan leven daarin blaast. De golem was eerst een ritueel om leven te maken en zo dichter bij God te staan. En later zijn we gaan kijken, kunnen we ook zo'n golem gebruiken om ons te beschermen. In de oudheid was dat een van klei opgebouwde man met spreuken. In de tijd van de alchemie in de middeleeuwen had je een Frankenstein die in een echt laboratorium met echte stroom tot leven wordt gewekt. En nu hebben we printplaten met programma's erop die we dan tot leven wekken met stroom.
Maar het blijft voor mij voelen als het verschil is met vroeger dat die golems gewoon in onze collectieve verbeelding leefden. Ja. En dat AI ook los van onze verbeelding daadwerkelijk bestaat.
Door bestaat. Dat is wel waar. Het is een golem die meer een eigen leven heeft, omdat hij voor zichzelf dingen kan beslissen. Nog steeds wel met de intentie van de bouwer, maar wel iets wat zichzelf ontwikkelt daarna binnen de kaders die de bouwer hem gegeven heeft.
Unlike the religious dreams of artificial life in antiquity, our modern creations really do seem to come to life. They learn and evolve exponentially faster than we do, so the question how we relate to these forms of intelligence that we create ourselves is becoming more and more relevant.
My name is Jim Al-Khalili, and I'm a professor of physics at the University of Surrey. Studying the innermost secrets of atoms and their nuclei has been at the heart of my working life. But there's another side to me. I was born and grew up in Baghdad to an English mother and Iraqi father, but left Iraq with my family in the late 70s when Saddam Hussein came to power. By then, science was already my great passion in life, and as I studied it further, I saw myself fully part of the Western tradition, inspired by names like Newton and Einstein. But buried away was this nagging feeling that I was ignoring part of my own scientific heritage. Leader, the Caliph Abdul Malik, had to find a way of administering this mishmash of languages. Like all the great figures of the Islamic Empire, Abdul Malik lived in a culture without portraiture. All we have are later impressions of what he might have looked like. His solution was sweeping in scale and inadvertently laid the foundations of a scientific renaissance.
It was this Abdul Malik ibn Marwan who said, this bureaucratic chaos has to stop. We cannot continue to run a government and govern all of this span of land with this Tower of Babel languages. So he wanted to govern it with a uniform language. That uniform language, of course, he wanted to be able to understand it, so he demanded that it be in Arabic.
But the choice of Arabic as the common language of the empire went beyond administrative convenience. The decision had extra force and persuasiveness because Islam's holy book, the Quran, is in Arabic, and Muslims therefore consider Arabic to be the language of God. The words of the Quran are so sacred that its text hasn't changed in over 1400 years. By comparison, English has changed dramatically in just 700 years. To our ears, Chaucer is almost unintelligible, whereas any Quran can be understood by anyone who reads Arabic. Making copies of the Quran has always been a specialized and highly respected job since the foundation of Islam. Calligraphy expert Naif Scarf, who lives in the Syrian capital Damascus, writes for mosques and in madrasas all over the country. These are words he's found himself writing over and over again, words of great significance for Muslims. They're the opening line to each chapter in the Quran. So what it says is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means in the name of God, the most gracious and the most merciful. So the same of Arabic calligraphy was enforced on them because of the spread of Islam, because they were worried the meaning of the words in the Quran would be lost if it was read by people who don't speak Arabic. Then they wouldn't, not only would they misinterpret it, they just wouldn't be able to distinguish between different letters. So not only did they add dots on certain letters, they also added other little squiggly lines which changed the sound of vowels, and it was something that they put in place just to ensure that people were able to have the right pronunciation when they read the Quran. Unfortunately for the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, the hieroglyphs contained no alchemical secrets. But what this story reveals to me is the insatiable curiosity Islamic scholars had about the world. They were desperate to absorb knowledge from all cultures purely on merit, with no qualms about the places or religions from which it came.
Most intellectual traditions, including, if I may say so, our own, tend to work very hard to keep everybody else out. Whereas here we have an example of an enterprise which is desperate, curious, to turn itself into a net importer of intellectual product. And that's a very important lesson for the history of the sciences.
I was set in the center of a vast, successful empire. It became home to an extraordinary flourishing of all kinds of culture. For this is the time described by 1001 Nights, of great and generous caliphs, magic carpets, great journeys, but also ambitious buildings, music, dance, storytellers, and the arts. Baghdad was such a cultured and vibrant city that one traveller of the time wrote, "There is none more learned than their scholars, more cogent than their theologians, more poetic than their poets, or than their rakes."
Quite frequently, people say, they like your programs a lot, but I never give credit to the almighty power that created nature. To which I reply and say, well, it's funny that the people, when they say that this is evidence of Almighty, always quote beautiful things. They always quote orchids and hummingbirds and butterflies and roses. But I always have to think, too, of a little boy sitting on the banks of a river in West Africa who has a worm boring through his eyeball, turning him blind before he was 5 years old. And I reply and say, well, presumably the God you speak about created the worm as well. And I find that baffling to credit a merciful God, that action. And therefore, it seems to me safer to show things that I know to be truthful and factual, and allow people to make up their own mind about the moralities of this thing, or indeed the theology of this thing. I mean, we made a film about chimps hunting monkeys. And that was an extraordinary and powerful and alarming and dismaying thing to see. They've got one. The hunters are tearing it apart. Again, people say, how can you put on such savagery of a predator catching prey? And you are milking it for violence. If they saw what you put out on the cutting room floor of this animal in suffering, I mean, it's a very narrow line you have to tread. You cannot, in my view, eliminate it entirely. That is to sentimentalize and to distort reality.